Welcome back, Misfitians, to round 3 of the Battle of the Brands. If you haven't watched the last 2 videos, I highly recommend you go back and watch them before seeing this one to get you all caught up on which paper brands have made it to the final round and why they are here. That being said, I will make sure to provide a link down below as well as one in the corner to get you to a playlist that will be covering all the rounds that we have done prior to this. So make sure to check those videos out before you watch this one. And for everyone else, let's go ahead and jump into this. So here's my plan for this week. We have 3 brands competing for the top spot, and that's going to be Arches, Fabriano, and B. And for this week, the objectives are going to be kind of short because we've actually looked at a lot of the objectives that I personally look for in paper. So this week's objectives aren't going to be as long and as detailed, but I'm going to give you a lot of detail as I am painting through these illustrations. Now, once again, I want to say this flat out, watercolor supplies are very much a personal preference to the artist. So these objectives are going to be targeted to what I prefer in my watercolor paper. And for round 3, the objectives are as follows. The very first thing that I'm going to be looking for is glazing. Now, I looked at glazing last time, but this time the glazing is going to be a lot thicker of paint consistencies, which can cause the paper to be overworked a lot easier, especially when you're using heavier paint consistencies. I've noticed that it can just peel or create little weird rough edges on your paper a lot faster. And that's usually because you're using less water. So that is something that I'm going to be looking for in this particular round. The next thing that I want to test out is mixed media. Now, for those of you who have been following me for a while, you know that I consider myself more of a modern watercolorist or a mixed media watercolorist. And I like to add ink as well as gouache and sometimes pencils and pastels. I like to play around with different mixed media. So for this particular illustration, I'm going to be playing around with ink as well as watercolor concentrates and gouache as well as pencil work. And finally, as always, I want to know the overall feel of the paper. So was this paper actually easy to paint on, especially with those heavy glazes and mixed media? And did I feel like I was fighting the paper at all, or etc.? So now that we have our objectives laid out, let's go ahead and start the battle round. So for this battle round, I'm going to be labeling the papers number 1, number 2, and number 3. So for paper number 1, let's look at the objectives. The very first objective is glazing, and yes, this paper did actually really well with glazing. However, I do want to say this particular paper, at first I didn't really like it, but then as I started allowing it to kind of do its thing and kind of mold with the paper, I noticed that the paint doesn't necessarily adhere as quickly to this paper, which is why you'll notice as the time lapse goes along that this paper, the colors are a lot lighter. However, since the paint wasn't adhering as quickly to this paper, it also gave me more playtime to make my gradients smoother. So that could be a pro or a con depending on what you want. If you want super vibrant colors, this might not be the paper for you because I found myself having problems to build up the colors. However, if you want more playtime on your paper and you really want smooth gradients, this paper I found I was really liking as I was painting along with it. The second objective for paper number 1 would be mixed media, and I will say this paper did really well with it. No issues whatsoever. The tooth of this paper is a very fine tooth. It reminded me a little bit of hot press paper, but still acted like cold press. So it was nice getting super smooth details. It was really easy using pencil line work on it, and gouache and the watercolor concentrates worked really well on it. So I have to say the mixed media portion of this paper was really good. And finally, overall feel, I would say this paper performed really well. I really enjoyed painting on this particular paper. I felt like it gave me a lot of playtime to mix my paints together, as well as allowed me to do really fine detail work. So those were my thoughts for paper number 1. Now let's move on to paper number 2. The very first objective that we're going to be discussing is, of course, glazing. And I feel like this paper actually did really well. It did decent with glazing, but I will say the paper started to overwork as I was using those thicker glazes. You can really see it, in my opinion, in the dark areas of the painting. You can kind of see this rough, almost ripping look of the paper where it's just overworked. But that being said, I still think it's a really good piece of paper to paint on for watercolor paper. It really did well with mixed media. It did well with the glazing. So that's going into our next objective, the mixed media. I think it did really well with mixed media. It soaked in the colors really nicely. I actually added more ink to this one and then had to do some lifting because it was the wrong color. So this one actually took a lot of abuse compared to the other two actually, but it still did really well. And I have to give it props. It did exactly what I wanted it to do for being a 140 pound weight paper. I do have to say, if I was doing this painting as a commission work, I would not paint it on a 140 pound paper because I know that this particular illustration is going to use so much water, it's going to abuse the paper. So the fact that all 3 of these performed really well for being a 140 pound weight, I was really impressed. I honestly thought by the end of this illustration, I would start having a lot more overworking towards the end. But to be honest, it did really well. All 3 of them did. But this one, I will say, out of the 3, was starting to wear out a lot quicker towards the end, especially when I was using those heavier weight glazes. So the overall feel for this one, I would say probably 75% into this painting, I was starting to feel like I was fighting the paper and really having to think about what I was doing and how to do it in a manner that would create the least amount of abuse to this paper to preserve it as much as possible. So I will say that this one started breaking down first out of the 3. That being said, I really like the overall look of this painting. I think the color looks really cool. I even like some of the textures that it allowed me to create, especially with the stone kind of groundwork on the edges. So I'm highly pleased with this one as well as an overall outcome. And finally, the last paper, paper number 3. The first objective is glazing. I think this one did really well with glazing. It handled the heavy glazes really well. I would say out of the 3, I felt like this one was layering and glazing with those thicker paints especially the best out of the 3. But I will say, when I was using the thicker glazes, I felt like this paper wasn't allowing me to create smooth gradients as naturally with the thicker glazes compared to the first paper that I was painting on. So I do want to note that, and I honestly think it's because of the tooth of this paper. Out of the 3 papers, the tooth of this particular paper is a lot thicker, which allows it to absorb more paint, and it also allows it to absorb more water and take more abuse, especially water abuse, out of the 3 papers. But it also, I felt like, was fighting me a little bit on my smooth gradients, which y'all know I really like smooth gradients in my illustrations, so I felt like this one was fighting me a little bit. The next objective is mixed media. I honestly felt like this one did really well with mixed media. However, that being said, once again, because of the tooth, I did have a little bit of problems keeping my lines sharp with my pencil work as well as some of my ink lines. So that is just something to keep in mind, but overall I felt like it performed really well. And finally, my overall feel of it, I would say this particular painting accepted the color or the paint most easily onto the paper. So you're probably going to notice out of the three that this particular paper, the color just seems to pop off the page compared to the other two. And actually, a lot of times I found myself having to lighten the color, realizing, oh wow, this is a lot brighter than when I was painting it on the other two. And so I kind of had to play around with that a little bit and gauge how much pigment I was putting on the paper, because I almost felt like as soon as that pigment hit this paper, it was almost like staining it immediately, which is great if you want bright, vivid colors. So for paper number 3, if y'all really desire super bright, vivid colors, as well as those heavy, dark glazes for dramatic depth in a painting, this paper would be really, really great, I think, for that. So those are kind of my overall feel and thoughts for these 3 papers. Now, for this round, I'm not going to be revealing the brand names in this particular episode. Rather, I want y'all to vote which one of these 3 papers you feel perform the best out of the 3. And you can do that by voting in the corner. There should be a little eye in the upper right corner of this video. If you click on that, there will be a poll in there. So what I highly recommend you do is make sure to vote which paper you feel like performed the best. And then next week what I'm going to do is reveal the paper that y'all voted on, as well as the one that I preferred out of the 3. I do have a preference, but I want to share that with you next week and allow y'all to have a voice in this series. Another thing that I'm going to do next week is also go over some of the other papers that were in the series and my thoughts on them. I know some of you had some questions and were curious about some of the previous brands and what specific papers that I use to paint on, and I actually have a link down below for all the videos. I've provided a link to my blog post on what specific brands I used for this particular series. So if you are interested in that, please always look in the description box. There's usually a blog post connected to each of these videos, so make sure to check that out. But I'm also going to be sharing my thoughts next week on the other papers that didn't make it to the final round, but I actually really enjoyed, and I want to share my thoughts on those as well. So anyway, that is it for this video. Hopefully you had fun. I know I did. I can't believe this series is almost over, but I actually really had a lot of fun putting this particular series together. Once again, please remember to vote, and lots of love, y'all, and I'll see you in the next video.